Number 6, Hampton-Sydney. Number 7, this is not my top 25 ballot.
Welcome to another D3 Datacast. Zach Snyder here with Matt Snyder, and I think we've hit the stretch run of the stretch run.
I'm wearing my stretchy pants, so we're ready to go.
Call those my Thanksgiving pants.
Thanksgiving pants, yep.
All right, this is an episode I've been looking forward to, Matt. We've got the new tournament selection and seeding metric system, NPI.
Someone should have told us about that.
Some of us have been talking about it for months, Matt. But some people are still playing catch up. And there are a lot of people that wish we had this first season of NPI kind of piloted alongside the old system that we've become used to, familiar with, the old regional ranking system where we had discrete buckets of primary criteria that the individual committees had to subjectively figure out how to objectively put those criteria on the scale to come to a decision on regional rankings manually, right? And I know there was a lot of consternation as NPI was adopted that this is this new thing that how's it gonna play out? And so there was a lot of interest in probably trying to maybe delay the implementation of NPI so that we could maybe see how it would work out alongside of a system that we've come to know and understand. That didn't happen. We got NPI. That is the law of the land. But Matt, here on the D3 Datacast, we have the ability to do multiple things at once. Last week, we would have had our first regional rankings, which were not actual rankings, but a list of teams in alphabetical order who might have been ranked based on their winning percentage and strength of schedule, because there was not a full data set yet with no previous regional rankings to be able to draw the results versus regionally ranked opponents criteria from. In years past, we've had an alphabetical set come out, and then that was used as the basis for putting together a first actual rank set, which, based on previous calendars, would have come out this week. So as longtime followers of the D3 Datacast know, Matt, we got pretty good at being able to predict regional rankings. So behind the scenes, we played out that process last week to put together alphabetical rankings. We've played out that process to put together this first ranked set of regional rankings. So we'll take a look region by region, how those regional rankings might have looked, and how the current picture of NPI through games played Sunday, February 16th. And we'll talk about some of the differences, maybe some places where, there aren't any differences, and then try to talk about some winners and losers. So a lot of fun. Before we get to that, Matt, we have a new top 25 poll coming out. That means you have a new ballot. Let's see it.
All right, now coming onto your screen for the very first time, and we did not have to edit this together because we had the wrong ballot on the screen, is my top 25 ballot. You can see it if you are on YouTube. For the podcast-only listeners, I will read down the list. Number 1 is Wesleyan. Number 2 is NYU. Number 3 is Wisconsin-Platteville. Number 4 is Randolph-Macon. Number 5 is UW-La Crosse. Number 6 is Illinois Wesleyan. Number 7 is Trinity of Connecticut. Number 8 is Emory. Number 9 is Hampton-Sydney. Number 10 is Washington University in St. Louis. Number 11 is Tufts. Number 12 is Christopher Newport. Number 13 is Redlands. Number 14 is Roanoke. Number 15 is St. John's. 16 is Calvin. 17 is Trine. 18 is Cal Lutheran. 19 is WPI. 20 is John Carroll. 21 is Gustavus Adolphus, 22 is Denison, 23 is Drew, 24 is Franklin and Marshall, and 25 is Wisconsin Lutheran.
Sometime we might put out that blooper reel, Matt, and my first reaction was going to be, boy, you didn't really knock St. John's down for their loss, and you didn't really give Roanoke a whole lot of credit for beating Hampton-Sydney, but you started going through your old ballot, so yes, you have indeed moved St. John's quite a bit down and Roanoke quite a bit up.
Yeah, that's what tends to happen after you have big games with big results is teams should move because your perception, your understanding of the overall quality or strength of those teams should move a little bit.
Okay, so it seems like every week there's about 5 teams at the end of the ballot that cycle through. I know Gustavus, Adolphus, and Drew have been 2 that you've mentioned being very much on your radar. Drew gets a second win over Catholic to really bolster their standing as the odds-on favorite in the landmark. Gustavus gets the
Yeah.
big win over St. John's, as we mentioned, a big reason for you moving them down. Um, and then Wisconsin Lutheran, they take another kind of surprising loss for where they have been ranked for most of the season. You know, they kind of had that one mulligan with the Illinois Tech game, but kind of hard to give them the benefit of the doubt after the second one they dropped.
Yeah, I think if you're going to be a top 10 or 15 team in the Northern Athletics Conference, conference games are tough. You're gonna maybe lose one, losing two to some of these teams, and a couple of the coupled with a couple of the close games they've played along the way. Like they had a really big scare against Dominican in a game they could have, would have, should have lost. So those things add together, right? It's not just did you squeak out a win in the Northern Athletics, but are you winning most of your games? Like these are games you pretty much have to win all these games. So they're hanging in there at 25, but I almost ripped them all the way out. And
Well, the crazy one involving them is I believe it was a home game against Lakeland. You look at the box score, it's
yes,
like, okay, yeah, they got a 12-point win, but that was after being down by 20
yeah.
at halftime.
And I like to give teams all 40 minutes. So if you win the game and you win the game by a good amount, that's fine at the end of the day. But yes, don't mess around with teams in the NACC. If you're going to be one of these top elite level teams, you need to win most of those games. And that's no shots at the conference. We just know it's solidly a bottom half conference. There's some good teams there, but it's overall there's not a ton of depth. The other big one you mentioned was Gustavus Adolphus coming in. They were a team that I had been watching very closely, particularly the last couple of weeks. Really wanted to see the St. John's game because they had the new schedule in the MJAC. They have somehow like not really had to play the top four twice. So this is like their only game against St. John's of the season. A little bit, I was a little bit nervous about the quality of their schedule. They were right there for me, right off my ballot. So winning that game against St. John's, I think, was a really good one for Gustavus Adolphus. Put them up at number 21 for me. That was big to see. And Franklin and Marshall, another team in the Centennial that's been playing great. They've been playing really good basketball right now. They've been climbing up our computer ratings, efficiency ratings. So I wanted to put them into my top 25 here because they look really, really good in the Centennial right now.
Any other top 25 thoughts, Matt, as you look ahead to the tournament and as maybe the tournament picture is really taking shape? Are there anything to note maybe in terms of how the top 25 picture does or doesn't align with how you're seeing the tournament picture taking shape?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that NPI right now is doing a pretty good job of lining those two things up. I know NPI is not it's not doing the same thing my top 25 ballot is, or like the computer efficiency ratings. I see those two things right now as more of who do I think would beat who on a neutral court, or maybe like a hypothetical 7-game series on a neutral court or something like that. NPI is more of a resume metric, more of what have you actually done. But I think we're seeing a lot of those same types of teams up in the top 8, 12 or so. It's a lot of those teams. So talk about the national picture. You're talking about top 25 picture overall. But I think this is showing us, I think the tournament's going to be pretty wide open. We just saw Roanoke beat Hampton-Sydney, for example. We saw Gustavus Adolphus beat St. John's. That was a team that had been in the top 25. We've seen this year Calvin beat a UW La Crosse, play toe-to-toe with UW Platteville. I think we're going to see a lot of great games in the tournament. I think a lot like last year. I think it's going to be wide open. I think there's easily 10, 12, 16, 18 teams. If they all got to not if they all got to the Final Four, but if 4 of them got to the Final Four, you wouldn't be super shocked to see, a John Carroll there, even a Denison there. Like teams like that have played really well at stretches of the season, and you wouldn't be shocked to see those teams get to Fort Wayne.
Yeah, we can project that there will not be 18 teams in the Final Four.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Matt, you mentioned different types of ranking systems are trying to do different things. But we have a new ranking system that's trying to do the thing that the old ranking system was trying to do. Previously, we had regional rankings where we had 10 different lists, and somehow at the end of the season, when it was time to make at-large selections and put together a bracket, those 10 different lists needed to intersect, and a process that maybe worked out okay for working out teams within a geographical region sometimes had a way of not really working out so well, trying to differentiate between teams, that were separated by quite a bit of geography and played very different schedules. And so now we have NPI, which gives us a single national list, and there's no subjectivity to it aside from the initial dial settings that the sport committees were tasked with setting. So any subjectivity to the system was laid out ahead of time, and it's just a matter of seeing how that all plays through with the game results that we get. Now, let's take a look, Matt. We've replicated the old regional ranking system, so we're going to take a look at that side by side with NPI. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this started last week behind the scenes. We had replicated the process just to put together an initial alphabetical list so that we would know, like, okay, a week ago, who were the regionally ranked teams, because then that feeds into that regionally ranked opponent criteria for this week. And with that full data set, in previous years, committees would have been putting out their first real ranked lists this week. So let's take a look now, starting in Region 1.
Yeah, so those who had followed our stuff for the last couple of years, we used to have like a fake rating metric which tried to put some of these discrete buckets into one number. We know the committee didn't actually use one number, but that helped us organize our lists automatically for the stuff we put on like d3datacast.com last year. So we relied heavily on this. We didn't spend hours and hours doing 10 region calls together to do this. These
Also,
are directionally correct. They're not going to, like, if you quibble with like 4 versus 5 on some of these rankings, fine. Like, that's totally valid.
right, and just to point out that that fake rating was based on kind of empirical
Yeah,
evidence
right.
and being able to try to fit what we learned from how regional rankings had come out, to try to force it into one number, and so it wasn't just what you think. It was based on observation and how it closely aligned with
Right.
how regional rankings were produced.
Yep. So this is replicating the old data here through this season. So this is the winning percentage, which we're all used to, but the old strength of schedule, which was just opponents' winning percentage and opponents' winning percentage, what that SOS number would be, and then using our last week, Zach, we did this in the background. We made like an alphabetical regional rankings, and these are the VRROs from last week. So we remember in the old process things lagged a week, so you wouldn't, if Williams was not ranked, but Wesleyan had a win over Williams, then that wouldn't be showing up on this data. You'd have to wait until next week's data when they're now ranked to get that. So remember, everything lagged. So you might see some things that don't line up. That's probably what it is. NPI, all this stuff happens all at once every time you calculate it. So if you have a good quality win bonus game, that just gets in the next day's data sucked right in there, and it's already there. So what we can see here is the winning percentage, the strength of schedule, and the results versus regionally ranked opponents for each team. What our kind of like picture would put them in the national perspective, since now NPI is going to be national. Like what was their old maybe resume going to be in the national perspective? What is that now in NPI? And then what's the overall difference? And you can see for a team like Trinity, the second team, there's no difference. They're like the number 7 team approximately both ways. For Wesleyan, there's a little bit of a difference. NPI right now has them as number 1, but in the old system, they might be 1 or 2 or 3, something like that. You see further down the list, you start to see some bigger differences. A team like Hamilton is not quite as strong with NPI as they would have been under the old system, the 792 winning percentage and the 577 strength of schedule. That would have put them in like top 15 or 16 range, we think. Right now, they'd be just outside of that, maybe 7 spots back at number 22. And then St. Joseph, Connecticut, number 40. Also St. Joseph's, Maine, around 40-ish. We always think of as kind of like the bubble cutoff line, or at least maybe where the bubble starts before bid thieves and things like that. But St. Joseph right now is kind of well back at that at 59. So there's a pretty decent sized gap there. Under the old system, we think that maybe Williams, with their 625 winning percentage and 1-6 results versus regionally ranked opponents, maybe would not have looked favorably. And I think they're still outside the picture with NPI, but maybe closer to that bubble line than they would have been elsewise.
And with the number of NESCACs showing up here, Matt, I think it's very easy to see and very easy to say that probably this change in system has been very neutral,
Yeah,
in terms of how the NESCACs have been treated. I know they've always been the behemoth in Region 1. Region 1 has always been kind of a top-heavy region, with the NESCACs dominating over the other conferences, really only broken up by the emergence of St. Joseph as kind of a national team out of the GNAC, when the GNAC historically has not maybe necessarily had that kind of team. But we're seeing a really good NESCAC year, and they're doing very well in NPI. And when you kind of retrofit it to how they might have looked in the old regional ranking system, it's
Yeah.
very similar. A difference with Hamilton, but that's maybe offset a little bit with the difference of Williams. And Wesleyan still would have been a top four. You see absolutely no difference in how Trinity and Tufts would have been handled. So yeah, I think very neutral. So anyone that maybe was in NESCAC land who was maybe worried that they'd be hurt by NPI, that doesn't seem to be the case. Anyone outside of NESCAC land who was maybe hoping that they would be hurt by NPI,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to be the case either.
And just worth calling out that the St. Joseph resume or the St. Joseph's main resume, they're not like what we saw the last couple of years with a St. Joseph team that was nationally elite. So it's not like they're being
Right.
hurt either. It's just that their resumes, the teams aren't quite as strong as they were.
Right.
So let's look ahead at Region 2. Region 2 right now is very, very similar to Region 1 at the top, where it's WPI, and it would have been WPI either way. There's really no change. They're kind of nationally seen by both systems, kind of right at the same spot. Keene State, even though they just took a loss this weekend, they are maybe even slightly helped by NPI, actually. Fairly neutral, but maybe slightly helped. Brandeis in a similar situation. Both these teams really kind of in similar ranges, right? Right now, Keene State is maybe just one of the last couple of teams in maybe that top 16 picture, whereas before they would have been one of the first four teams to be out of that picture. So maybe a slight variation there. But overall, I think Region 2 kind of lines up with NPI like it maybe would have overall. Maybe one difference is that like a team like Suffolk is several spots down, but really either side of things, like once you're like Brandeis, Babson, like they wouldn't have been in at-large bid picture anyway. So it's not really like it's changing the landscape or the picture of who would be an at-large contender. Maybe the only thing to note is it was a really big deal who was inside the region, inside the regional rankings. So in Region 2 here had 6 teams ranked for men's basketball last year. Like if you were Western New England at 6, that was a big deal for your opponents. Whereas Western Connecticut at 7, that was, didn't really offer anything because you're only looking at regionally ranked opponents. Whereas now we have the quality win bonus, which is kind of trying to do a similar thing, giving you extra credit for beating good teams. But there's not like 10 cut lines in every region around the country. It's just one cut line. And I think, Zach, you're looking at maybe where approximately that is in the national picture right now. I think it's maybe somewhere around 150 or so.
Right. So under the current dial settings for NPI, the men's basketball committee chose to set a quality win bonus starting at with any win over a team with an NPI of 53 or higher. Now that was a choice they made, and
Could have been different. Yeah.
could have been different, but that's just the choice they made. We've seen other committees message that they tried to set it more in like that 70 to 100 range to replicate the number of teams that were ranked under the old system. Excuse me. But the men's basketball committee wanted to make sure that a wide range of teams and conferences had access to quality win bonus type games, right? So they set it a little bit lower. Right. So, but we're working off a national list, so it doesn't matter if you're in a strong region, weak region. I think we see a little bit of that here, right, Matt? We've got WPI and Keene State, both very strong teams nationally. You see that NPI, but then you get down to that third line, and you see teams getting ranked, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Of course, Region 2 is the outlier. All regions had 7 teams ranked, except for the smaller Region 2, which had 6. And you're talking about at that point whether you're talking about how you're lining up the old criteria system under your fake rating or under NPI, you're talking about teams outside of the top 50 overall. But is one of those places where you got to rank someone, and you also had a system where it was very important that you are regionally ranked and that you're playing teams that are regionally ranked. And so, Matt, I think at this point it's worth bringing up the multi-region conference discussion, right? Because that was always a big talking point. You see Brandeis here, and of course the UAA, they have teams in Region 2, Region 4, Region 7, Region 8, Region 6, right? So they're spread out. So they had a lot of access to regionally ranked games because they had teams spread out all over the place. And so now everyone's working off the same list. It doesn't matter what region you're necessarily in. You could have 20 teams in Region 6 that are above that quality win bonus team, right? It just matters how good you are in relation to the nation, not what your distribution is across the country. If you're a multi region conference, or you know, congratulations to you. You played a team that got ranked in a weak conference or weak region versus, oh, sorry, you played this team that is really good, but they're playing in a deep region and they couldn't get ranked. Oh,
Yep.
well, we can't give you credit for it.
All right, Zach, let's page ahead to Region 3 here. Region 3, I think, has maybe not traditionally, but the last few seasons been one of the weaker regions, and I think maybe we're going to see some of that on this slide here. Up at the top would be some Liberty League teams, Vassar and RPI, mix in Farmingdale State from the Skyline. But you see here maybe some stark differences from where they would have been pictured in the old system versus where NPI sees them. Some of that might be some of those regionally ranked wins. You see 5 Liberty League teams here that we think probably had a good shot at being regionally ranked under the old system. That means Liberty League teams have a lot of opportunity then here in Region 3 to get regionally ranked games and get regionally ranked wins, and those were a big deal. And we saw the committees weighing them heavily because it was one of their 5 primary criteria, one of their tools to make decisions on. But with the quality win bonus being a little bit more democratized in the NPI, maybe it's less of a big deal. We see a bunch of these teams, even RPI starting there at number 57 down to Ithaca at number 86 overall. So we're not talking about top teams in the country, but we're basically talking about this whole region, even in the old system being kind of like 50 and below. And now in NPI, most of them are like 50 to 100 in that range. So it's still quality win bonus, but they're not going to be getting big quality win bonuses, and probably not as big of a bonus as maybe the old committees might weigh in seeing a team that might be like 4-2 versus regionally ranked opponents like Vassar and say like, well, that's a pretty strong number. NPI is saying it like, well, who are those exactly against? And it can make a numerical judgment against that, and it's going to maybe kind of knock those teams down a little bit.
Right. And it's a more extreme example of what we saw in Region 2 after you got past those first two. You got teams that nationally are outside the top 50, and then NPI sees them even further outside, but it's not like we're going to highlight these as really important games as results versus regionally ranked opponents just because they're in Region 3 and we have to rank 7 teams in Region 3, right? We're not gonna reward opponents based on that. No, we're gonna say NPI is gonna say, no, this team's number 51, and so any team that's beaten them, we're gonna reward them accordingly, or they're ranked 112th, and so if someone has beaten them, we're gonna award them accordingly. Similarly, if a team that's ranked 112 who would maybe not have snuck into Region 6 region rankings, historically a deeper region, well, the team that's beaten them can still get credit for that win, even though they wouldn't have been a regionally ranked opponent in Region 6.
Yeah. All right, jumping on to where Region 4, or what Region 4 looks like right now. This is the NYU and NJAC show, and it would be even now, but in the regional ranking picture, a team like NYU wouldn't really change. They're still like a top 2 overall team. You do start seeing a little bit of shuffle with the NJAC, which is maybe interesting here. Ramapo would have been, I think, pretty solidly a top 16 team under the old system. NPI thinks they're more like 27, just outside. Stockton is pretty similar both ways, maybe 17 versus 13, so not a big difference there. Montclair State, TCNJ both would have been outside that picture, kind of in the 29 to 30 range. So maybe some agreement between the two systems on where like Montclair State and TCNJ would be. But then you see some fall off to Stevens. The 0-2 probably wasn't great, but like that 740-ish winning percentage with like a 525-ish strength of schedule. Quite often, teams with that resume were right in the mix for the bubble. I think Stevens, even with this, would have been off the bubble with the 0-2. But NPI has them even further back at 72, so it's not buying that type of resume, which was maybe a little bit more viable in the old system. It doesn't look like that type of resume is extremely viable in NPI.
And the Stevens numbers there are very interesting, just in terms of kind of the rules of thumb or the kind of the quick and dirty checks that we got used to under the old system. Anything under 700 winning percentage, you were needing to see some sort of major outlier, usually in the SOS number. And then, Stevens with a 523 strength of schedule that had gotten to be kind of where we saw a bit of a minimum, right? I think the way that things trended a little bit more towards strength of schedule in recent years, that anything under like a 520 is when you got talking into maybe some potential strength of schedule issues. And so, yeah, Steven's right there. Kind of marginal in terms of competitiveness under the old system.
Yeah.
Certainly, the 0-2 is not where you want it to be if you're going to have numbers like they have to the left of it. Um, and I think that shows up in kind of like a 59 ranking under the old system. But again, you see that not looking quite as favorably under NPI.
Yeah, and that you're right. That Stevens would have been an exercise in like, what if you set everything to the minimum? Like, are we competitive? Well, no, right? Like, you can't be at the minimum
Right.
cutoff line on everything and be competitive
Right.
across the board. An interesting
Now, Matt,
one just outside the top 7. I just want to call out Kane here. Just a 542 resume, so not, or winning percentage, not viable at all. They would have been like 114, so not even an afterthought in the old system. Still not viable in NPI, but 63 tells us that there's something there about Kane that the new system is responding to favorably, even though they would have been well out of the picture. It's still just because you have maybe an outliery resume doesn't mean you're completely out of the mix. Now, Kane needed to win several more games to get themselves in the mix here, but at least their NPI has them in the direction of being competitive, even more so than Stevens. And you look at those old metrics, and you would have thrown out Kane just from the 542.
and certainly not getting into the regional rankings mean that teams that had wins over Kane wouldn't be getting any sort of reward for that. And I want to talk about both Kane and Rowan, right? As you see, as the sorting here, they're both under the old system. You'd see them as pretty solidly outside the top 100, but here they're both inside the top 70 in terms of NPI, which means you look at teams like Ramapo, Stockton, Montclair State, TCNJ. They're getting a bunch of opportunities for quote unquote good wins against each other. But under NPI, you got to add Kane and Rowan into the mix for that, as well as good wins that are good wins that never would have shown up under the old system.
Right. So those teams, those NJAC teams, are getting pretty decent enough quality win bonuses if they happen to beat Kane and they happen to beat Rowan, because NPI sees them as fairly competitive teams, right? Not nationally elite, not in the tournament picture, but quality win bonus worthy.
Now, what's interesting, Matt, because we've talked probably even on this show and just kind of for fun between the two of us, that we always felt like something about the old system really seemed to like the NJAC, right? They always seemed to have you had a number of teams that would come out with good winning percentages and strength of schedule numbers that looked really good. Now, at least through this first season of NPI, it doesn't look like that was necessarily a quirk of the old system. I mean, NPI doesn't have a lot of differences with how these 4 NJAC teams are being treated. So, for whatever reason, we felt like maybe the old system was favorable towards the NJAC. That seems to either we were unfairly saying that it was favorable when it was just maybe they're just good teams and should be rated highly, but that seems to be also the case with NPI.
Yeah. Okay, Region 5, Centennial Conference at the top. We've talked about Franklin and Marshall. They were on my top 25 ballot. They would be at the top here. Under the old system, though, they would be very strong. They would be on the fringes of a top 16. Right now, Franklin and Marshall is a bubble team. So that is a pretty big difference there out of the Centennial. Interestingly, though, that big difference doesn't really follow down to Gettysburg as much. They are hurt by this, but they're kind of more in a similar range, 22 to 30, not as big of a difference. We see with Catholic next, they are in a very similar range between both the old system and NPI is where kind of we think that they would end up. I don't quite know. We haven't dug in enough to know exactly what that is for all those 3 teams, but it's probably something about who you played, how it's building that SOS. I think maybe anecdotally, we'll talk about like some takeaways later, but I think the old system, I think like a low 700s winning percentage was maybe ended up being overvalued in the old system, whereas NPI is not that impressed. You can win 75% of your games against a lot of different types of schedules. If it's not like a really elite schedule, then NPI is going to be like, you're kind of on the bubble. I think that's maybe kind of what it is here. Interesting that a team like Drew, though, down there at 5 in the old system, just a 512 SOS, but NPI respects it a little bit more. They've won 87% of your games. So even if your schedule is a little bit more marginal, winning, high 80s, almost 90% of your games, that is the computer or the NPI system seems to think that is still a little bit more difficult to do. Even though the schedule wasn't as strong, they've still performed quite well against that. I should also take this time to point out there's no one-to-one corollary on the old SOS to like how actually strong your SOS is, right? That was just your opponent's winning percentage and their opponent's winning percentage. So we've all know, right? We can all name them. There are teams around the country we know are not good teams, but they're going to win 16, 17, 18, maybe 20 games in a weak conference. In the old system, if you played those types of teams, you could have a good SOS, and maybe that was an emptier SOS. So I don't know that applies to any of the teams on the screen here, but that was a situation where we observed in previous seasons where NPI tries to get through that with iterating through your opponent's actual rating as your strength of schedule.
And the other thing to talk about in terms of how the old system worked is you had that section that looked at results versus regionally ranked opponents, but outside of that, it didn't matter so much who you beat, who you lost to. You were looking for how things came out in aggregate in terms of your winning percentage and strength of schedule. And Matt, something that jumps out to me in terms of how Franklin and Marshall, looks under the old system compared to how NPI might view them just a little bit less, is they have a loss to Elizabethtown, which is a loss that's getting towards like the back part of the or is outside of like the top 250, right? So it's not a loss that you would want to see from a tournament viable team. And the way NPI works is you're going to get more credit for no matter like how high the higher up the range or up the rankings you get a win, you'll get more credit for it, and you'll get dinged more for a loss depending on how low it goes in the rankings, right? So losing to a team like Elizabethtown this year is going to hurt Franklin and Marshall a lot more. Yeah, under the old system, they would have taken the winning percentage hit, right? And probably playing a game like that would hurt your SOS too, but there wouldn't be any sort of highlighting on it in terms of how it hit your resume aside from those two hits. Because as long as, once you throw everything in the basket, as long as it comes out looking okay, it's not really going to hurt you maybe any more than any other loss would.
Yeah, along those lines, we should call out bad wins used to be really bad for you. You would hate to play the worst teams in your conference, and you would beat them, and your resume would get worse because your SOS would just go down. In NPI, we have the opportunity to drop once we reach that minimum wins threshold. If we have more than 12 and a half adjusted wins in men's basketball, you can drop those bad losses from your resume so they don't hurt you. So we're not saying, what did Drew do against whoever the worst team in the landmark is. It's not really material to a discussion here when we're talking about like regional rankings or at large picture. So that is also a team who might have hurt an SOS in previous seasons that doesn't hurt as much in an NPI season.
Yeah, right. So currently, like, they have wins over like a Goucher, a York, New York, Lycoming, Juniata, right? These are teams that are not having good years that under the old system, they'd be dragging down that strength of schedule. But right now, Drew has enough wins that those wins above the minimum win threshold can fall off the resume, right? They don't have to take on additional wins that would hurt them.
Right. Let's talk about how good the two wins over Catholic are, not that they beat York, New York twice, and that's going to drag them down, right?
Right.
Let's not.
Right. They're not going to get penalized for winning games that they should win.
Right. All right, Region 6, we know this has been a strong one for a long time, and it would have been strong under the old system, and it is still strong under NPI. Emory's kind of like a top 4 or 5 team. Christopher Newport is kind of in that top 10 mix as well. Randolph-Macon, a top 10 mix. Hampton-Sydney, a top 10 mix. Where we start to get some difference, though, is in the 5-6 spot. Roanoke would have been maybe like a top 20 team. Let's throw Virginia Wesleyan in there, kind of like a top 20-ish team. NPI more thinks that they're like top 40 teams. So there is some discrepancy there between what Roanoke and Virginia Wesleyan would have done. And if I can characterize like very unscientifically, I feel like these are two programs that do very well at beating the teams they're supposed to beat, but then maybe not turning around and getting top-notch wins very often, right? Roanoke just beat Hampton-Sydney, so like that's a really good win. But I feel like that's kind of maybe characterized these two teams a lot the last couple of seasons. So really good SOS games, but in NPI, maybe not as many of those quality win bonus games because you're not winning as many of those. So still strong resumes on both sides, but something that maybe would have been a little bit more valued by the old system than the new system. But both these teams this year are maybe hoping for that, stay in that tournament mix should they not win the ODAC Pool A.
And again, two teams in Maryville and Belhaven out of the CCS that, if you look in totality, the old system what could have valued as like a top 50 team and right in that range for NPI, but teams that have been able to get wins over Maryville and Belhaven wouldn't have been getting credit for those in the results versus regionally ranked opponents here,
Yeah.
based on how things stand with them being just on the wrong side of that Region 6 cut line.
Right, and it's really interesting seeing there, and like maybe Maryville would have been in over Guilford or Belhaven would have whatever, but you can see NPI thinks those three teams are almost identical, right? You play Guilford, you play Maryville,
Right.
you play Belhaven. That's like an equivalent games, let's call them. Under the old system, one of those games would have given you regionally ranked credit. The other two wouldn't have because you only have 7
Yeah.
slots in Region 6.
No, that's a great thing to point out, Matt. It shows just how arbitrary those lines were, right? Yeah, I called out Maryville and Belhaven, but you're right. When you talk about Guilford, those are three teams all in the same range, and they just happen to be 7, 8, 9, and we're gonna draw this arbitrary line at 7, and sorry, that's the way things stack up 1 through 9 because you're in Region 6 and not Region 3, and
Yeah.
so, good on you if you were able to beat Guilford, but, sorry if you've got wins against Maryville or Belhaven.
Sorry that you would have been ranked 3, 4, and 5 in Region 3, but now here you have to be unranked. Yep. All right, Zach,
Yep.
we're bringing it home here for Region 7, our home base. Interesting name at the top of this list. We think under the old system, we would have had Chatham there at the top of the ranks with 826, 528. That's a strong resume under the old system. 3-0 versus regionally ranked. We looked into this one a little bit, and we think under last week's alphabetical system that St. Vincent would have been ranked before we had any RROs in the mix. So they're still 3-0 as far as the regional rankings are concerned for this week. National kind of top 24. Now NPI still likes them quite a bit as well, but that's a little bit of a gap there at 36. Somewhat similarly is John Carroll. The old system I think would have put them around 32. New system maybe more bubbly at 40. I think Denison is a big winner in this the new system NPI. Their SOS we would have had it around 500 right now. We think that's not great in the old system. They were also 0 in 0 because Worcester I think was not in the previous week based on their metrics, so they had not yet garnered their VRRO. But right now NPI is thinking like they're a potential host. They're maybe in and around that top 16 spot. So Denison is looking strong. That's a big change from maybe where they would have been valued with just that 500 and 0 and 0 versus what NPI thinks of them. Maybe some of that is that live nature of NPI. It can just calculate all the information at once. It doesn't have to lag a week to get some RRO information. Very interesting for us, Zach. Calvin would have been exactly the same. Our fake rating and NPI both had them at 44, so kind of on the bubble fringes there. So they would have been in a very similar position under the old system and new system. Very interestingly, Trine is a big winner in the new system. The 488 SOS probably would have been a non-starter in the old system. Just a 2-2 VRRO wouldn't have stood out that great. I think they would have been kind of out of the mix at this point. NPI thinks they're very much in the mix, and there's some scenarios where they could still end up hosting if the end of their run ends up well for them. And then the opposite side of that is Wabash. The old system, well, I mean, they weren't a very strong resume in the old system, but they were maybe more toward viable with a 565 strength of schedule. We've seen teams at around 650 get into the tournament, a lot higher SOSs than Wabash had, but NPI does not think that their resume is quite that strong, and it has them several spots lower.
And I think this is the best example we've seen yet of the problems with the regional ranking system and how it lagged a week with relying on the previous week's regional rankings to then feed into the next regional rankings. Of course, the way NPI works is it's an iterative process,
Instantaneous.
daily or instantaneously, right? It runs the iterations, to adjust for things like quality win bonus and where teams rank and giving credit for wins and losses appropriately. that all runs until it reaches that steady state, right? Whereas it feels like we never reach a steady state under the old system, and in fact, it takes a full week to get that iteration where we're relying on who was regionally ranked last week to then carry through to the next week as we're doing it again. So you talked about that, Matt, with Chatham, if they're getting credit for 2 wins. Now let's point out, the other win they're getting credit for is Carthage, which
Yeah.
is a significant
Yeah.
win for
Good
them.
win. Good win.
But St. Vincent, as we're looking, under this first real rank system, St. Vincent is out, which means that if we were to relook at regional rankings next week, they would be looking at a 1-0, not a 3-0. Denison here, you have to look at, they've got wins over Worcester and Wabash. So while they look like a 0-0 here, suddenly that looks a lot different, right? When they're getting, let's see, are they a 4-0? I think they've got one with Worcester still left, but
Okay. 3-0.
that's 3-0 right there. And then yeah, so I mean, it just shows the problems all over the place with it taking a full week to do an iteration that NPI does instantaneously just as part of its natural calculation process.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing, maybe the difference between Worcester's 512 SOS and Trine's 488 SOS felt like a big deal under the old system, kind of like a faux fake 500 cut line. NPI doesn't see any big distinction there, and I think in actuality, if we treated the old SOS as even a real number to begin with, like 512 to 488, that's not that probably big of a difference, that close to 500. So they would have been really similar, like a 52, 53 nationally. But NPI really expands the gap and say, no, Trine is really good here. And Worcester is the team that's maybe kind of more 50-ish nationally.
Right. And we got used to under the old system looking like, okay, yeah, I had, Alma and Kalamazoo this week. I know
Yeah.
that I'm going to take a strength of schedule hit, but I've got Hope and Kelvin next week, so I can count on getting a strength of schedule boost, right? I mean, these were the kinds of things we had to worry about in the changes from week to week. So I feel like we've seen a lot smoother process with NPI, and like we talked about with some games being able to fall off your resume if adding additional wins would hurt you beyond the 12 and a half. I mean, that's going to really help a team like Trine, who probably is looking a lot better under NPI because they're being able to wipe away uh, some wins that really they probably got penalized for. We know that there were examples. It's following this in years previously. A team goes 2-0, and the improvement in their winning percentage somehow in combination with the strength of schedule hit, if you did kind of a blind this versus this, you'd take the one, before
Yeah.
they got the 2 wins versus after they got the 2 wins.
Yeah.
So it was just there were certain aspects like that that just never made sense that to some degree NPI at least tries to address.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. All right. Region
All right,
8.
yep.
Region 8 at the top, I think, looks pretty similar. The top two spots, Illinois Wesleyan would be kind of in that like 10 to 14 range under both systems. Wash U would be kind of hoping to get one of those last couple of hosting spots under both systems, I think. Carthage is a big difference. Previous season, they would have looked pretty good, okay, probably a at-large team. Under NPI right now, they're threatening for kind of a top 16 type of a spot. That resume looks really good under NPI. U Chicago is kind of where they would have been under either system. Wisconsin Lutheran is actually a big winner under NPI. They're another type of team, just like that 480 SOS, but they have a really good winning percentage against it. NPI says it's really hard to win that many games, so you are a viable team. A team that I'm surprised, just given what their winning percentage in SOS looks like for me, is Anderson. The old system, they would have been probably like bubble out. Right now, they're looking. I think they're still bubble, but maybe at least current NPI is more on the positive side of the bubble. We'll have to see what happens down the stretch for them. But yeah, they're a team that is now improved by NPI, even though their old metrics were pretty good but not outstanding. Maybe a little bit more toward the Stevens, a little bit Stevens plus resume. I think when we looked a few slides ago, we'll call Anderson.
Yeah, and I think Franklin, pretty similar numbers there to Anderson. Matt, not looking as good with the 0-4 compared to the 1-2 versus usually ranked opponents, but yeah, I think maybe if you take some of what we maybe heard in terms of some of the motivation for moving to a system like NPI, I think that maybe how Anderson looks here is an example of some of the types of teams that people were hoping to help, right? Some
Mhm.
teams from maybe not necessarily major conferences that might have had a hard time getting a path to an at-large bid. And if you're getting into a conference where you're having to play a bunch of teams that are not that great, and it's lowering your strength of schedule. Now with the ability to start dropping some wins, if you play a really good
Yep.
non-conference schedule and take care of business in conference, you have the ability maybe to come out looking a little bit better than you did in the past.
Yeah, and the non-conference portion of that is interesting, Zach. I didn't think about this before, but the committees tried to use non-conference strength of schedule as a secondary criteria if they couldn't make a decision on primary. But
Which they
now,
said they tried to never go to.
which they tried to never go to, they wanted to make a decision on primary criteria. But there was a sort of an admission that we want to see what teams are trying to do out of conference. Now we didn't get the winning percentage; we just got the SOS. So it's not just like as a conference bringing you down necessarily. I think we do see that now. If you're not in a strong conference and you go out and you play teams in non-conference that are strong, then and if you win those games, then you'll have the opportunity in conference to drop some of those wins that would have dragged you down under the old system. And then it is that non-conference portion that, hey, I went out and played these other good teams. Look at our record against them. Those are what's staying in there. And the SOS that would have looked bad in the past, some of those games actually end up being hidden in NPI because, again, let's not worry about your the worst like 1, 2, 3 teams that you beat. If you have enough of these other wins, like let's talk about the good wins, not focus on the bad ones. All right, Zach, Region
Region
9,
9.
the upper Midwest. We've got two WIAC teams at the top. We've got UW-Platteville, UW-La Crosse. They would be, I think, overall pretty similar to where they were on the old system. Both, I think, hurt, but kind of more marginally by the new NPI system. They would have been really strong under both top 8 candidates for sure. Then we have two MIAC teams that kind of switch places a little bit in Gustavus Adolphus and St. John's. They would have been, under the old system, Gustavus would have just taken the lead probably, especially with the head-to-head, kind of nationally 26th with St. John's 33rd. But under NPI, Gustavus, as of Sunday night, sits 33rd, and St. John's was still kind of 17th. So even though that SOS, as we talked about, is only 513, looked like NPI thinks there's a little bit more meat on the bones of the St. John's resume, the last game notwithstanding there. But then we get like Nebraska Wesleyan, I think would have been in similar position, both positions. We would have been talking a little bit more about UW Eau Claire under the old system. And they would have, it's actually Stevens Point right now that's still kind of on the bubble. Eau Claire maybe would have been in that mix as well, whereas right now under NPI, it doesn't look like that they're really bubble viable at this point.
And Eau Claire was another one that I wanted to look into, Matt, in terms of NPI making it matter a lot more. Who did you beat? Who did you lose to? Rather than just how does it look on aggregate? Because they do come out looking better under the old system, it appears. And they're another one where they've got a pair of losses that are more kind of like fringe or outside the top 200 right now. So those are going to be more detrimental than they would have been previously. So that could be a case where Eau Claire's getting dinged a little bit more by NPI because they're 0-4 against the top 2 in the WIAC, right? So they have good wins. Don't get me wrong, but that's why they're kind of in the 60 range. They do have good wins, but a couple losses well outside of the range that you really want to see is going to hurt them more in NPI than probably would have really shown through previously.
And for teams who have played Eau Claire or have played maybe UW Oshkosh, who's not on this list because they're more like their
Right.
record's more like 500y. NPI sees those two teams as very similar, even though record-wise, the old system would have kind of thrown out Oshkosh and kind of elevated Eau Claire. So if under the old system, you really would have wanted to now have played and beaten Eau Claire, and played and beaten Oshkosh isn't really helping you. Whereas under NPI, both of those games are still very similar because NPI sees those team qualities as overall very similar.
One more region, Region
All right,
10.
well, let's wrap up with Region 10. This is our island conferences, the SCIAC, the ASC, the Northwest Conference, etc. Here we see Cal Lutheran under the old system would have been pretty far and away the top team. They would have been kind of top 16-ish. Redlands would have been next, although I guess we haven't assessed very fully the head-to-head nature of that necessarily. But under NPI, it's Redlands that has the lead right now over Cal Lutheran, so that maybe those two teams would have flipped. Interesting that the old system maybe would have liked Mary Hardin Baylor due to their strength of schedule above teams like Trinity, Texas, or Whitworth. Whereas NPI is more fond of Whitworth. Whitworth is very strongly in the mix. Even St. Thomas, Texas, more strongly in the mix. But kind of nationally in the previous systems, those strength of schedules, kind of 480, 475, 495, wouldn't have really played. And I wonder if we're seeing some effect here of kind of island conferences having maybe less ability to really ratchet up those SOSs. They're maybe more limited in who they can play, and maybe finding other conferences that their region mates aren't tapped into as much. You can't just bus from Texas 3 hours and go play a completely different region, right? You're probably still in Texas, or you're playing teams in your conference or the conference next to you. That's it. So maybe these island teams were hurt in the old system by their inability to schedule a lot of those games, and so they ended up with maybe more middling strength of schedules. NPI is less concerned about an SOS number, right? A number that was probably fake under the old system anyway, and is more concerned about trying to kind of more assess the quality, that iterative nature of the resume. So resumes like Whitworth and St. Thomas, I think, are better off in this. I think those types of teams are better positioned under NPI than they were in the old system.
And another example of under the old system, at some point, you get penalized for winning a bunch of games that you very much should win. Whereas there's that cutoff point where after a certain point, you're no longer have to take any sort of penalty for winning games that you should under NPI. Yeah, man, you talked about like kind of the scheduling nature, and I think this is something we've talked about. I think maybe it came up in a mailbag answer earlier in the year, but under the old system, where your primary concern was getting ranked as high as you could within your region, it was very advantageous for, say, a Mary Hardin Baylor to go to Southern California and play a Claremont Mudscripts and a Pomona Pitzer, or you'd get some of those SCIACs going up to play a pair of, you go up and play Whitman and Whitworth or something like that. So you get those really good Region 10 versus Region 10 games because those are, for one, just good games, good opponents. But if you could go up there and get head-to-head wins, suddenly that gave you an additional leg up. And now, as we've talked in the past, there's certainly a leg up for beating a team, for getting a head-to-head win, right? For that game, if you beat a team, you will have an advantage within NPI. But there was a more overt advantage, I think, under the old system than there is currently. And I know there could be still some logistic reasons why those sort of Region 10 versus Region 10 games are still going to be played. Just it's probably a lot easier to get some reciprocity. You just say, hey, Northwest Conference team, we'll fly to you, you fly to us, and you kind of get a 2-for-1. But under the old system, I'd love to see, if you're going to get on a plane, instead of going to get on a plane to go to Seattle, get on a plane to go, like Cal Lu did this year, to go to Illinois Wesleyan and go and get, go play Illinois Wesleyan and Calvin, right? You get two really good games against teams outside the region. And if you're having teams fly in, it would be great to see, some teams from other regions fly in. But again, like I said, I'm sure that there's some savings involved with, kind of two birds with one stone. I'll fly once, you fly once, and kind of, that works out nicely for Region 10 within Region 10. But I think that what was a real advantage to getting those good head-to-heads to help settle the Region 10 picture in the regional rankings before is off the table now.
I think one thing that this whole look kind of shows is the committees were tasked with ranking the regions and then selecting a national field based on the 5 primary criteria. And I think it shows how blunt of tools that they actually had. You just were given a winning percentage number and a strength of schedule. VRRO, the regionally ranked opponents, was the only way to kind of look inside those games to any degree. You were just kind of given a number and said, go. I know NPI is just one number as well, but you didn't really know like, well, what is Trinity's 495 SOS? How many of them were just like, okay, the worst four teams of their conference were really bad, maybe, versus they didn't actually play anyone. You don't really know that just by given a number. So yeah, if you have
Right.
870 and 870, then you take the one with the higher strength of schedule. But you don't really know what's inside that very much. You just had this was the number and let's go with it. NPI, at least the way it's formulated, at least tries to assess what is the quality of each team, not just, well, what do they have, like, do they have a good record, and then average it all out for all the teams, and then that's what it is. So I think the committees did a really good job with the tools that they were tasked with. They were just not were given tools that were optimal. I think it was a good process for a while, but then I think now we have better tools that we can give selection committees to make different picks now.
And hopefully this kind of look shows that there are certainly differences, but hopefully along the way we were able to kind of suss out why those differences occur. And I don't think it's wild enough. I know there's a lot of concern about implementing NPI right away, but I scheduled for this when now the whole system has changed. Like, I don't think this is going to cause wild changes. In fact, I know a lot of the committees I had gotten to the point, and I remember one of the concerns that we know came out of the soccer committees is they felt like they had done a really good job kind of building up messaging and kind of getting things to where they wanted it to be, that they were concerned with that being upset. And I think that's similar
Yeah.
with the men's basketball committee. But within setting the dials, I think they were able to try to set dials in a way that maintains some sort of consistency. Now, I can't say that all the committees necessarily did a great job. I tend to think that the football committee didn't really understand the assignment and they kind of went off the board. But I think what we've seen here from the men's basketball committee, and I haven't followed quite as closely with the women's basketball committee, but it seems like they've done
Yeah,
a good job
really good job.
with with their dials and it with what they were trying to do with them, and that basically working out pretty similar. So I don't think there's going to necessarily be a lot of adjustments. And in fact, is there some way that you could game the NPI system to your advantage with scheduling? Maybe, but I think that it was a lot easier to game the system under the old regional ranking system. You could kind of expertly craft what was going to be a good SOS schedule by trying to target teams that you knew were in weaker conferences that you could beat, but then they would get into conference play and rack up a bunch of wins, and that would make your SOS look good. And I feel like NPI kind of takes that off the table. Matt, maybe this is a good time to segue.
Yeah.
Past the region slides here, because we wanted to talk about kind of some quote unquote winners and losers here. So let's go in, starting with some NPI winners, so to speak.
Yeah, this first one's really general, but teams under the old system whose resumes ended up looking like 900 winning percentage, 490 strength of schedule, that was kind of like, well, you better win your conference tournament, because if you're under 500 on your strength of schedule, you're really not going to get a pool C. That was kind of a heuristic from the old system. NPI doesn't really see it that way. NPI is going to say, well, there's not really a big difference between 490 and 510 anyway. If you're winning at a 900 clip, we've already dropped a whole bunch of your worst wins anyway. So we're not even really including the fact that was kind of bringing down your SOS. It's really hard, almost no matter what your schedule is, to win 90+% of your games. NPI is not going to just throw you out. It's going to say, well, you're probably in the mix somewhere. You might not be, just because you won 90% of your games, you're not going to be necessarily a top 16 team if you really don't have a very strong strength of schedule. But to be in the mix, those teams weren't in the mix before. NPI very much does put them in that kind of at-large conversation at the very least.
Yeah, there were definitely some very broad value judgments that were made based on certain thresholds that we just knew. Like, you could write a team off, they have a strength of schedule problem,
Yep.
right? But it was a more of a function of how that old system operated on buckets in aggregate rather than a system that really tries to parse out, uh, okay, yeah, maybe you have a bunch of wins over teams that you should easily beat. But we're not going to let that necessarily drag you down if you've also shown an ability to consistently beat a bunch of really good teams.
So along the line of kind of an extreme resume with a good winning percentage, low strength of schedule, I think just extreme resumes in general are handled more positively by NPI. And by extreme resumes, I mean like, what was it, like the 3 years ago Rochester resume that got so much debate over should they be in, should they be out? I think under NPI they would have been in pretty easily. I think we ran the numbers on that season, and they would have been in quite easily. Resumes like that, when you have a really strong strength of schedule, I think just your average Joe isn't as good at comprehending like what does that mean for how difficult it is to win your games. So just like NPI says, hey, it's really hard to win if you're playing even like pretty good teams like a 490 SOS is like an averagey type schedule. Winning 90% of your games is pretty good. If you play that strong of a schedule, if you're in like a 640 whatever SOS schedule and you can win 60% of your games, that's probably pretty good too. So I think NPI doesn't throw out those types of resumes either. I don't think we have like at that extreme of an example. I didn't remember seeing those on the SOSs as we saw a couple years ago with that team in particular. But NPI would say that's a reasonable way to get in as well. Let's assess that as part of it. Be in the mix. Again, it's not just play teams, don't win any games, and you're like a top 5 team. It's something that can allow you to be in the mix, even if you take some losses.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, the set it and forget it nature of NPI helps in situations like that, because it's with the extreme resumes where um, fairly or unfairly, criticism or accusations can get lobbed about the certain subjective
Mm-hmm.
portions of the previous process, right?
Yep.
So with the dials are set and what plays out, right? So there's no even ability to hint about the influence of
Right.
some shadowy figure in the corner of a dark room, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
I think it's the cases with the extreme resumes that again, you hope that that kind of thing never happens in actuality, but we know in when sports are discussed on the internet, certain things are going to get accused of happening, whether or not they're actually accurate.
And a third broad strokes winner I'll call out is teams who play and probably beat middling competition from good conferences. So I'll say like your average WIAC team. We've often said over the last several years under the old system, like Calvin ends up playing a few WIACs in non-conference every year, but that's the worst conference to play because there's going to be a team that's 15-10 and they're really good, but your SOS isn't going to look. It's not going to be that impressive in your SOS to play a 15-10 team if that's one of your best non-conference games. You take UW Oshkosh. Right now, I think they're 13-10, so you're like a little bit over 500 for your SOS if you play UW Oshkosh. You beat them if you don't lose to them twice. But currently NPI thinks that they're like a number 50 or 60 team in the country. So by NPI, you're like, that's a quality win bonus type team. That's a pretty strong team. It's okay to play them and beat them, even though their record is not going to end up because they're going to be maybe in the middle of the WIAC. Things like that. We know it's a good team. You'd be better off playing Sarah Lawrence out of the Skyline or something like that. A team who's having a good season, probably not as good as UW Oshkosh, even though their record might end up better than UW Oshkosh's this year. All right, Zach, let's look at some losers. I just laid out 2 here. There's probably more, but I think actually NPI is helping more teams than it's systematically hurting. I know for every team, every spot a team moves up, another team has to move down a spot. But like we saw some resumes that would have just been thrown out entirely from the old system, and I think those are maybe not thrown out entirely. But there's not really a team whose resume was perfect under the old system who's now not viable at all. Like that doesn't even really make any sense. So I think there's no big losers. But I'm going to say in general, teams that had a 700s winning percentage. I think under the old system, we always thought that was fine. That was good. You're doing fine. You're right in the mix. We went through 10 regions, Zach. I counted 25 teams that were kind of in their regional ranking zone that had a winning percentage that started with like a 0.7 something. Of those 25, 17, when we looked at the difference, 17 of them are now worse under NPI than they were under the old system, and 2 are unchanged. That means only 6 of the 25 are better under the NPI system than they were. So I think fairly overwhelmingly, the 700s was kind of not like a safe zone, but an okay zone, like you're above the thresholds, whatever fake thresholds existed. And I think that's not really that safe anymore. I think that's not really a good, you don't really want a squishy middle. You don't want like a 700, 535 under the old system that looked kind of fine, or like a 750, 535. That's not really that good under NPI.
And that's
And
probably replaced by some of those other teams where we would have just cast them
throwing them out.
aside
Yeah.
because of strength of schedule problems before. But when you actually get into the details a little bit more, who did you play, who did you beat? Really, there's in the details of those resumes, there's really no difference between
Exactly.
what we thought of acceptable, looks good, safe before, and oh no, they have a strength of schedule problem, even though they won a bunch of games.
And wrapping up this last point of this segment before your computer signal completely gives out is the NPI losers are teams who lose their toughest games. In the old kind of like rolled up aggregate SOS system, you wanted to play some tough games. If you lost them, as long as you beat a couple teams that snuck into the regional rankings, hey, your SOS would look good. Under NPI, you don't get any quality win bonus for just beating the worst teams. You need quality win bonus for beating the good teams. If you lose all of your tough games, even though your SOS looks good and your winning percentage maybe is like 70% or above, old system, hey, you were viable. New system, you're probably going to be behind a bunch of teams because you didn't get the quality win bonus like you could have. And those teams are kind of goes along with the first bullet point here, but those are teams that aren't quite as looking as good as they did under the old system. So that's kind of our comparison, our regional look. What would have been if we were still under the old system? Teams that are maybe trending up, trending down versus NPI as we travel through year one of this new system.
So we're not going to take another run through our updated bubble watch at this point. We're going to count on updates daily from you, Matt. I don't know if you're ready to commit to daily updates, running 1,000 sims every single day, but I guess I'm going to lock you into that expectation. So we're not going to cover that today because we'll put that episode out, and then the next day there'll be another fresh run. But Matt, there was something that I identified as I was looking through the results of the sims that were run through play Saturday that I thought might be helpful to look through because it's interesting, and sometimes it can be hard to contextualize some of the odds that we see based on the results of the simulations, right? So there's a really interesting dynamic playing out, I thought, in the NJAC. Of course, we've got 4 teams in the NJAC right now that are looking very, very strong for Pool C should they need it. And they're all very tightly grouped in both the efficiency ratings and in how they're being rated in NPI. The NPI rankings have Ramapo at 18, TCNJ at 22, Stockton at 24, and Montclair State at 28. Of course, all 4 of those, Matt, currently outside the top 16 that we would expect to see get priority or preference for being a host in the opening weekend. But then on the page, the NJAC page that you can see at d3datacast.com, Matt, where there's a nice summary for the entire conference in terms of where they stand, current season to date in NPI, but also based on throwing in those projections through the end of the season as well. We can see this for every conference there on d3datacast.com. But if you look over there on that yellow section that shows the projected data, look at each team's odds for those national top 16. We talked about all 4 of those teams are currently outside the top 16, but you see pretty tightly grouped of odds ranges there. 26.8% odds based on the simulations that Ramapo finishes in the top 16. Similar, 26.7% for TCNJ, 17.8% for Stockton, 12.5%, Matt, for Montclair State. So while that suggests that any one of those teams is fairly unlikely to finish in the top 16, I think you have to look at it more as a case of how the NJAC collectively looks. Because those 4 teams are so tightly packed, as the simulations are running, who's going to win the NJAC? Is it going to be Ramapo? Is it going to be Stockton? Is it going to be TCNJ? Is it going to be Montclair State? I don't think any of those 4 teams winning the NJAC conference tournament would be a surprise. But what this, of course, whoever does make that run, Matt, will have added some good wins. So the thing that I noticed that was really interesting is, let's move a column over from those national top 16 percentage odds and look over percentage odds for Pool A, right? So this is in the simulations, what percent of the time are these teams winning the NJAC conference tournament? Ramapo, 27% of the time. TCNJ, 26.2% of the time. Stockton, 19.4% of the time. Montclair State, 18.4%. So you put these 2 columns together, And there's quite a bit of symmetry in each team's odds of winning the NJAC conference tournament and their odds in the simulations of finishing in the top 16. So again, while the odds show that any individual team has, basically like a 1 in 4 shot of finishing in the top 16, what it tells me is whoever it is that ends up winning the NJAC conference tournament is very, very likely to be in the top 16. So at this point, we don't know who it's going to be, but I feel like we can say with great confidence that there will be an NJAC team who is in that top 16 at the end of play. When they're going to make a bracket, there's going to be an NJAC team sitting on that one of those seed lines that should be expecting to host. So a little extra to play for, playing for that automatic bid from the NJAC, but very likely along with that comes hosting rights for that opening weekend.
We've been talking about that as a wild conference all season long. This is going to be a wild tournament. I think it was last year for sure. And you're right. I think the only way we don't see an NJAC in the top 16 is if we get a team like Kane or Rowan or New Jersey City, anyone else below that top 4 winning the Pool A, which could totally happen in the NJAC. So that's a thing. But if one of those top 4 teams do go on and win that conference tournament, I think you're right. I think we're likely to see that team in the top 16 and put themselves in great position to host. Not guaranteed to host, but in great position to do so. And, like 90, you add up those those top 16 odds on the screen on the NJAC page, and it's like 90% plus that someone will be in the top 16, Zach. So I think you're absolutely correct that the dynamic that we're seeing here is which one of these teams will go on to win the NJAC tournament. That's going to come with the Pool A for sure, and it's very, very likely going to come with a top 16 spot as well.
And I thought this was interesting to start talking through, not just about the NJAC, but it's starting to bring a little bit more context to what some of these numbers mean, Matt. Drew is another one that I saw out of the Landmark. Their Pool A odds and their top 16 odds are very, very similar. Mm-hmm. So if Drew goes on to win the Landmark Conference tournament, very likely they are in the top 16. If they don't, very likely they're outside the top 16. They're a little bit of a different case because they're, sitting at 13 coming into play Sunday. So a team in the top 16 goes on to win it and they're in the top 16, maybe so what, but we can start to see, where these things line up, where it's just a matter of in or out. You can start to identify maybe with more specificity what some of these paths are. Whereas a month ago you saw, I don't know, like, what does it mean? I know, Matt, behind the scenes, we've been trying to talk through some scenarios, like in what cases are, seeing these two teams from the Centennial Conference, is this an and situation or is this an or situation, right? And even, another one I was looking through, Matt, was Trine's odds of finishing in the top 16. I think, they came into play Sunday like 30 or 31 in the total NPI rankings, but in the Sunday simulations, it was still showing like an 11.6 or 11.4% chance that they finish in the top 16. So just now we know a little bit more specifically what their path is going to be. I thought, I wonder if I look up on the Massey ratings, what a win probability would be like for playing at Calvin twice and like hope on a neutral court, right? Because we know at this point that the MIAA tournament is going to be at Calvin. Trine still has that regular season finale at Calvin. So if they, based on those Massey win probability odds, were to win at Calvin, neutral against Hope at Calvin, it was very, very similar to what was being shown as their top 16 odds, right? So there's still a chance that Trine gets into that top 16, and we can start to see exactly what it would take, what that path very specifically looks like for them to see that play out.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about regional rankings today already, but something we maybe didn't see in the old system. I think it probably existed in the old system, but we just didn't see it very much because our pictures were very regional. We were looking at 10 snapshots across the country of regionality. Now we're just looking at one picture, one national picture where we know where the teams fall. So you take specific results and you say, a game like the NJAC final, let's just say that it's Ramapo and TCNJ. You're going to get the winner and you're going to get the loser. And with NPI, we know what that's going to mean on a national landscape. Like the winner's up 5 spots and the loser's down 5 spots or something like that. We didn't always get that picture in the old regional rankings because if we were just looking at Region 4, it was maybe the winner stays where they are and the loser stays where they are or goes down like 1 spot. So it didn't always look like teams shuffled all that much by the end of the season. In NPI, we'll see that very clearly because we're going to see where they jump on the one big national list, right? We're going to see that regional ranking list. No one's going to care. So it's really about the national list and where they jump. And I think you've brought this up, Zach, previously this season. NPI is going to look like it's more dynamic because we're just seeing it on a national scale.
It'll be interesting though, Matt, because I feel like even with this past weekend playing out, we're seeing the bubble picture really kind of separate, where it's really going to come down to how many bid thieves are there impacting the situation, and then with what probably are just like a handful of spots left up for grabs based on what the simulations are showing. It's just a matter of, are there teams that were maybe in better standing that hurt themselves by stumbling, or were there a couple teams that had a worse off starting point who were able to maybe get a couple good wins on their way to losing a conference final that really helped themselves. It's going to be interesting to see what that final picture actually looks like that last weekend, because I feel like where we're sitting right now, we're seeing a great deal of sorting already take place, where you could say that there's maybe only a handful of spots, if that, really up for grabs.
And I think what's going to make a big difference is, are there really unlikely results happening? Like we saw Case Western Reserve win on Sunday, which against was University of Chicago. That was doing computer simulations. The computer thought most of the time Chicago won that game, but they didn't. So that is a result. An unexpected result can still jar the results a little bit, but in the absence of those big results, then we're going to start to see the picture solidify. That's for sure.
All right, so hopefully that adds a little bit of context to start thinking about these numbers as we're seeing in the projections and the final numbers as they play out here in the final weeks. And we'll keep that rolling on d3datacast.com. Keep checking that site daily. The current games date to play, NPI numbers will be updated there daily. And Matt, I think it's time to hit that daily cadence on the simulations too.
Yep, we'll be doing that. And remember, we've been talking around it this whole slide here, but when we do the simulations, we sort a lot of things by like average NPI, just because that's the easiest way to do it, or maybe tournament odds or something. But when it comes down to the last couple of games of the season, it's going to be a team's NPI is 70 or 50, and we're going to show them at 60. But right, it's not going to land at 60. The difference isn't going to be that stark. But right, it's either going to be up or it's going to be down. It's not going to really be that average number. The average number is really good when there's 10 games left. When there's 2 games left or 1 game left for any team, it's this or it's this, and if there's nothing in between.
Yep. As you're running simulations a month, previously it's this or this or this or this or this or that, however much. We're at the point of the season now where it's those ors are, the number of ors are really decreasing, which makes it fun, but also means that there's a little more reality coming, I think, with these projections. But like you said, when you see an 85% to 15% favorite like Chicago was against Case, and that goes in the favor of the 15%. Well, suddenly, in terms of the simulations with Chicago, the computer thought 85% of the times it looked like this. Well, now we're in that lane that was based on the 15%, right? That's where we're going to see the biggest changes. Anytime that there's a result that goes as far away from expected as possible is where we will see the biggest movements.
Yep.
All right. Speaking of big movements, Matt, let's go to the picks.
I'd like to skip this section, but we have to talk about it every week. Going through last week's picks, Zach, first game was WPI versus Clark. WPI were 4.5-point favorites on the road. They won that game, but only by 2. So Clark covers that computer line. We both miss that point. The next game was Salisbury and Christopher Newport. The computer had Christopher Newport as 12.5-point favorites at home. They only won that game by 2. So Salisbury covered that one. Zach, you get the point. I lose that point. That's going to be a trend here. Then the third game was Stockton and Ramapo, one of those crazy NJAC games that we just talked a whole bunch about. 2-point road underdogs was Stockton. Ramapo won that game in double overtime by 2. So we talked about how you can't predict the NJAC, but here the computer almost perfectly predicted the NJAC on this game. So we pushed that one. No points awarded for that game. You are muted right now, so I can't hear you.
Oh, there we go. Push the button again. 2.5 years into the picks. I think we had one push. Since then, right, we got into this year, go a few weeks in before we have our first push of the year. This is our 4th push already. We are doing poorly in the picks, but Matt, I got to say the computer is nailing it.
Yeah, the computer is the real MVP here. Then that's for sure. Game number 4 out in the Landmark was Catholic and Drew. Drew were 2.5-point favorites at home. They won that game by 7, so Drew covers the computer line. Zach, you get the pick. I missed that one. In our D3 Datacast game of the week, out in the NJAC, St. John's and Gustavus Adolphus. St. John's were 2.5-point road favorites, but Gustavus won this game by 4, really coming in strong the last 4 or 5 minutes to wrest the lead away from St. John's for good.
Yeah, Matt. Wow, got to give credit to Gustavus there, Matt. As my reasoning for making St. John's my pick, we noted, as we have earlier in the season at various times, how much of a veteran team St. John's is. So that really gave me confidence to pick them. But I got to say, as that game played out down the stretch, it felt like St. John's was the one missing some free throws,
turning the ball
over. Gustavus was the one making some clutch shots, some clutch conversions of opportunities. Credit the Gusties. They definitely won this game, and to whatever extent the veteran nature of that St. John's team would have been, could have been, should have been, whatever, Gustavus was the superior that day. They earned it.
Really big for Gustavus's Pool C odds as well, getting into that at-large race should they need it. Devastating for people on the bubble. Don't know anyone like that though. So anyway, let's move on to the let's recap where our leaderboard stands here. Zach, you are 2-2-1, so that brings you to 34, 37, and 4 on the season. I was 0-4-1. That's my first goose egg this season, I'm pretty sure, right? I don't think
I appreciate you giving the opportunity for me to have a mediocre week and still make up some ground.
So I'm still up 3 games on you, 37, 34, and 4 so far. So let's go to this week's pick, Zach. 5 new games. We run them through the computer. We get computer predicted scoring margins, and we pick against those. First one down in what is left of the American Southwest Conference. Hardin-Simmons at Mary Hardin-Baylor. 3-point favorites for Mary Hardin-Baylor. Zach, your pick.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Hardin-Simmons. I think I've been burned a couple times this year picking against them. I got to say, I feel like Mary Hardin-Baylor's highs have been a little bit higher, but maybe their lows have been a little bit lower. Hardin-Simmons a little bit maybe more consistent. Give me Hardin-Simmons.
All right, Zach, I'm going to go against you. Mary Hardin-Baylor, going to give you an opportunity to catch up another point on me. But Mary Hardin-Baylor, I feel like, has spent most of the season in the driver's seat, at least where NPI is concerned. I think they are, maybe not quite in that mix for at-large. They think they need wins like this to try to pull themselves back toward that mix. This is going to be a big one in that conference race. So I'm going to go with Mary Hardin-Baylor by 3 at home. Next one in the CCS, we've got Maryville and Belhaven. Zach, your pick.
I've probably underrated Belhaven most of the year, but I'm going to go with Maryville here, Matt. I wanted them to be my first pick in our conference champions draft heading into the season, so I'm going to pick them here. I know they were your pick. That's why I wasn't able to pick them. So what are you going to do, Matt? Are you going to pick for yourself or against yourself?
Zach, I picked Maryville in the conference champions draft. They need this one to try to pull even with Belhaven in that conference race. I think they're still alive in that. We had Coach Placeris on our live episode, what was that, 10-ish days ago or something like that. And he just told me I need to pick Maryville more. I need to believe in their team. He gave me some straight talk, Zach, that you were his favorite Snyder brother for the reason that you are always believing in the Scots. And for that reason, I am going to go with Belhaven in this game. I think they look really strong. I think this is a tough game. Conference battle. Belhaven's going to try to claim that outright conference championship, really not up their conference hosting rights. 3-point scoring margin at home. Maybe the Scots prove me wrong, but I'm going to go with Belhaven on this one. Sorry, Coach Placeris. Put it on the bulletin board. Zach, we're going to Centennial Conference for the third pick. Franklin and Marshall are 2-point road favorites at Gettysburg. How do you pick?
Give me the home underdog with Gettysburg. Though I will admit, Matt, I think that F&M probably has not been on my radar as much as they deserve to be. Here the computer's showing them respect 2-point road favorites at Gettysburg, but give me the Bullets.
Yeah, I need to be diplomatic about this pick here, Zach. I think you're right. I think the computer's been respecting Franklin and Marshall. They've been playing really good lately. I think Franklin and Marshall is below the national radar, and when they should be right on the national radar. I'm going to go with Franklin and Marshall. And I'm going to give the 2 points on the road because I believe in how strong that F&M is playing right now and see if they can secure the point for me. We're going to go up to the Conference of New England for our fourth pick. It is Endicott in Western New England. Western New England are 6.5-point favorites at home. Zachary, your pick.
Big one in the CNE race. Give me the leader getting 6.5, please. Endicott.
All right, Zach, I believe in Western New England. I believe in them playing at home. It is a big line. I thought about the line for a little while, but Western New England, I think, secure their position in the race at home. I think that they win this one, and I think they can win it fairly big. So I'm going with WNE. And we're going to go back to the heart of Texas, Trinity, Texas, and St. Thomas. 4.5-point favorites are St. Thomas at home. Zach, what do you want to pick for the game of the week?
I want to pick Trinity. I am aware that there may be some injury situations going on with the Tigers there, and I don't know exactly how that's going to play out coming into the game. But man, I'm a little dubious on St. Thomas overall. I gotta say, getting 4.5 here with a team that in my mind I think I like better is an easy call. Give me the Tigers.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a close game, but I think I'm with you on that 4.5. I think that's just too big for where this game is. St. Thomas is a team that I had voted for a while this season, kind of at the last couple of spots, but they weren't always a team that inspired a ton of confidence even when they were getting wins. It just doesn't seem like they've played the best schedule out there. It doesn't always seem like they've been beating teams by a ton. They did take kind of a really questionable loss here in the last week or so. So I'm not really believing in St. Thomas right now. They're still right in the middle of the national picture when it comes to getting into the tournament and at large and whatever. Trinity's kind of trying to get their way back in there. This feels like it's a bigger game for Trinity than it is St. Thomas. And I think you're right. It feels like Trinity might be the better team or coming into their own as the better team at this point in the season. So there we are, Zach. 4 games different and 1 game the same. Big opportunity for you to maybe pull all the way back or for me to take a bigger lead here.
But for neither of us to catch up to some of the people making picks in the comments, Matt, we're getting thrashed.
Yeah, as is yearly tradition, Ryan Scott will just beat us to death in the comments with his picks. So appreciate seeing everyone's picks as they've done all season long.
Yep. Shout out to William as well. Also, just taking us to the cleaners. All right, Matt, let's go on to the mailbag to wrap up this week. Let's start here with one from JR. What conferences do the bubble teams need to keep an eye on come conference tournament time? Matt, I think if we're looking ahead at potential bid thief conferences, this past weekend was pretty interesting. I think maybe we saw a couple clear out, but I think there's definitely a few to talk about. I mean, the one that always stands out in my mind, Matt, you got to start up with the Little East, with Keene State being a heavy favorite. Just the way they've been a behemoth program in that conference. That's always the one that jumps out at me. People don't want to be seeing Keene State get knocked out in the Little East tournament.
Yeah, the one thing maybe though that helps the Keene State of it all is, it doesn't help Keene State, but they took a loss this week to Western Connecticut. I think that puts them a little bit more bubbly. I haven't seen all of the scenarios. They're still 75% Sunday morning, so I think they still look pretty good, but they're now a team that if they do take the loss in the conference finals, I wonder if some of those bubble teams will come up ahead of them. So I think maybe Keene State is not as solid. I think that loss helps the bubble teams a little bit more.
Well, it certainly doesn't. Yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt the bubble teams.
We just talked about St. Thomas and Trinity. I think bubble teams are watching that. If St. Thomas takes another loss or loses early in that tournament, they might be a team that falls off the bubble, making the SCAC a for sure one bid league. I think we're definitely always watching the ODAC. I know JR is connected to the ODAC, but teams like Virginia Wesleyan are very on the bubble. So if they lose, if they lose early, maybe they fall off the bubble. I think the Centennial's a big race right now. We just talked about Gettysburg and FNM. Johns Hopkins, they're probably really only on life support, but not completely dead there. That would be an interesting one to watch, though. If someone other than FNM and Gettysburg wins, like they're good enough to win the tournament, right? And so
yeah, exactly. I was gonna say their Pool C odds at this point might not be great, but if Johns Hopkins won the Centennial Conference tournament, would anyone be surprised? I wouldn't.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit, Matt, talking about Gettysburg and Franklin and Marshall. That's where it's one we've specifically talked about with the Centennial is this an and situation or is this an or situation, right? How is there a scenario where the Centennial is a 3-bid league because Gettysburg and Franklin and Marshall look pretty solid.
We just talked. So we just talked about that head-to-head game. Like, you think the loser of that game, they're both on the kind of bubble inside of things right now. Let's say one team loses that game for sure. Then what if that team loses again in the conference tournament? They may have fallen from bubble in all the way to probably out, taking 2 losses. So it's just going to be like a really interesting conference and dynamic. I think the SCIAC, always interesting to watch. They have 2 teams kind of in at-large bid picture right now, Redlands and Cal-Lu. Will they both stay there? I don't know. But then you're always just upset watching, right? Does something crazy happen in the NESCAC or the CCIW? Like, you could see a team like North Park or North Central somehow winning the CCIW tournament. That wouldn't be that crazy of a turn of events. Like, we've seen those teams compete and beat the top teams in the CCIW. I'm not saying anything bad. I'm saying the CCIW is good, so they're going to be okay with that. But that would make the CCIW probably a 3-bid league, not a 2-bid league like we're expecting right now. Even Wisconsin Lutheran, we've seen them take a couple of losses to teams in the Northern Athletics Conference. They're still probably good. I don't think they'll fall all the way off the bubble, but that could add another team into the picture there. So you're just looking at those at the picture, those locks and those solid teams. If they don't win their tournament, that's probably just means that a bid thief team is coming in there and taking spots.
Well, I mean, maybe not. I mean, with you talk about the NESCAC, I mean, you got 4 teams in that locks and near locks. So as long as one of those 4 wins the NESCAC tournament, it's like no harm, no foul. You don't really care which one. But Matt, let's talk about the NUMAC. WPI is in that category. If WPI doesn't win the NUMAC tournament, there's no one else really showing up here prominently in the bubble watch from the NUMAC, right? So if you're on the bubble, you want WPI to win the NUMAC. If you talked about Wisconsin Lutheran, you don't want to see Wisconsin Lutheran lose in the NACC. Denison in the NCAC, that's another one that bubble teams are going to want to be, seeing the Big Red go through and win the NCAC conference tournament. So those are the ones, bid thief wise, that I think are really important. But you mentioned there's, even outside of the bid thief situation, there's going to be a few interesting ones to watch.
Yep, for sure. And right now in our simulations, we're seeing about 3.5 bid thieves on average. That means if you're one of those last 4 in, kind of I think I posted on Twitter a mock bracket and I showed who are the last 4 in. On average, those 4 get pushed out. So those are the spots you don't really want to be in. If you're in that 21, 20, 19, 18 NPI spot, you should kind of think of your spot as not secure at all. You want to win your games. You want to think about winning your Pool A for sure. And then once you find yourself done, you're rooting for no upsets in the country.
And then no conference tournament, Matt, in the UAA. But I think at this point we've got a group of teams that's probably pretty safe to root for if you're a bubble team, right? You want to be, or rooting against. I think at this point, Chicago is the one who is, they entered Sunday looking solid. We'll see how that updates on Monday after they took the loss to Case. Brandeis was not able to pull out a victory at Emory, so that hurts them. I think Carnegie Mellon's out of it. But basically, if you want to watch the UAA from a bubble fan perspective, any win by Case, Western Reserve, or Rochester certainly does not hurt. And any loss by Chicago and even Carnegie Mellon probably at this point doesn't hurt either.
To say it another way, like, you're okay with NYU winning because they're going to get in anyway. You're okay with Wash U winning because they're going to get in anyway. You're going to be okay with Emory winning because they're going to get in anyway. And then if you're a bubble team, you want to root against Chicago, and you probably still at this point want to root against Brandeis, even though they probably needed that Emory win that they nearly pulled out. It was an overtime loss, but they probably needed that one to get back in the mix of things.
One more here. In the mailbag, Matt, Jeremy Brown sent this one in on X. I want to know if there's been any discussion about men and women co-hosting with some of these larger facilities. Certain men's and women's programs who always seem to be in line for hosting are having to start on the road when this may be avoided in the future. Now, I'm not aware of this topic being anything more than a non-starter. I don't think there's really been any movement towards it or any appetite necessarily to allow like an opening weekend or second weekend hosting opportunity for men and women. Of course, just to clarify for anyone who doesn't understand the context here, this is a year where the women's basketball side of things has priority for hosting. So like the case of for the first weekend, second weekend the priority goes to the men. So like the expectation right now would be that NYU would be certainly one of those top 16 seeds on both sides. So we would expect that the women would be hosting, whereas the NYU men's team will be on the road for that first weekend. And then should both advance, they're both looking very solid in top 4 position. That would mean we would expect to see the women on the road that second weekend because the men have hosting priority. So just the question comes, a program like NYU this year, could there be a possibility in the future where someone's not sent on the road? Could they both get the hosting opportunity?
Yeah, and I think we're all aware of the issues, right? You're going to be bringing 8 teams, 8 programs to one site. You need game day staff that can handle that many games in one day. You're probably doing like a 1, 3, 6, and 8 o'clock game, which is doable, but you'd just have to be able to make that work. You need to have practice facilities and locker room facilities and court time for all these teams. So you would need like a main gym and then like a secondary gym where all these teams could have schedules. We know things like this sort of work, but does it work for an NCAA tournament type of a thing? I think that's the discussion. There's some programs that could handle that have the facilities, that have the staff, but there's maybe not everyone to do. I think this would be cool if we could move in this direction. I think, like you, Zach, I'm not aware of any active like conversation or legislation toward this. So right now it's an either or, but it would be there's like a hosting form questionnaire packet of information you have to submit to be able to host. What if in the future there was a way to say like able to host both, and then here's all the requirements, really strict requirements on what your facilities are like, what your locker room space is like, how can you achieve it? You need all of these things.
Hotel rooms.
Like how can you do this? Again, there's probably a certain percentage can't even host 4 teams or have a big enough facility to do that right now. Fewer would be able to do 8 teams and do men's and women's at the same time. But for those really big programs who really want to make it work, like I'm sure Illinois Wesleyan would love to be able to both have their men and women at home. Would they want to do that? I don't know. But would there at least be a path for them to try to do that? That'd be something cool in the future. But yeah, right now we're not allowed to do that. There's barriers, and maybe that discussion will go on going forward.
Maybe it will, Matt. But sometimes I look at some of the actions and I feel like when it comes to hosting on the outside, we think more of it than maybe like the internal discussion. I think about what's coming with the new bracketing principles with the top 8 this year, and the messaging has been very specifically that the protection afforded to the top 8 is about balancing the bracket and separating top teams from each other, even if that comes at the expense of hosting opportunities, right? So I know we put a lot of focus on hosting. It's a great opportunity, but sometimes I think that we, on the outside, think of it as a higher priority than maybe it is. And remember that wasn't just those top 8 bracketing principles are not just like an edict from whatever. That's based on a survey that was sent out for championship enhancement proposals and was put in place as a result of feedback from membership.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And I think another roadblock I should call out is there's probably some concern that maybe women's basketball would be shortchanged in this scenario at the expense of the men. Maybe their times would be given worse priority, or their facilities, they'd be given the auxiliary gym where the men's teams would be given the main gym. And it's nice. The even odd thing, like, right, men might have to go on the road if they're both in a position to host. Women might have to go on the road the next year if both were in line to host. But in that year, that team that's home gets the full attention. And I think there's probably something in the student athlete experience that's worthwhile there as well.
Yeah, I think that covers it. Matt, that wraps up this show. Let's talk about our great supporters at patreon.com/D3Datacast. We've talked a lot about data and all the things that we've got posted for fans to follow down the stretch run at d3datacast.com. It's all made possible by the partnership we have with these great people. There's no ads on d3datacast.com. All the great information is not put behind a paywall that you have to log into. And it's thanks to our partners here that make that possible.
Thank you so much. We enjoy doing these episodes. We enjoy sending out D3 Hoops content and having the D3 Hoops chatter on Twitter, social media, YouTube comments below. So we thank you, everyone who's partnered at either the $3 Good Job Team level or the $5 Great Job Team level. It means so much to us, and it helps us do these episodes and have a lot of fun with Division III basketball and covering it and giving the teams and programs the support, the recognition that they all deserve.
And special shout out to Matthew joining us new this week as a Great Job Team supporter.
That means there's now 2 Matthews that enjoy the D3 Datacast, so really appreciate that. Zach, for now, though, we're going to have to sign off this week. We're going to say, good job, team.